Hello, and welcome to Open Source as a project model for internal work. If you'd like to follow along with the slides, you can see them at opentalk.clamp.in. My name is Kevin Lamping. I am a front-end developer, mostly. I also am a parent of two beautiful young boys, and I love to have a lot of crazy time with them. I'm currently a front-end developer at 4Kitchens, but that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about what I did at USAA and Rackspace, two very large companies. But I should say that I'm not a representative of either company, and all the content is my own opinion and not that of the companies themselves. So let's get started. Why USAA, why Rackspace? Well, while I was at USAA, I'd have frequent conversations about infrastructure with coworkers. Infrastructure for me is the code that helps developers write code. So it's the underlying code. You can think of it like HTML templates for the overall structure of your website, or a JavaScript framework or library that you use to build out specific parts of your web app or your website. I was part of the infrastructure team, and I would work with many of my coworkers, and we'd have frequent conversations about what it's like to work in infrastructure. One of the things we talked about was that we had this growing team, this large audience of developers that we were there to support and to help. And when you're talking about supporting 300 plus developers, it gets kind of difficult and it gets kind of tricky to maintain. And we'll talk about that in just a second. My coworkers' focus was on the server side. Mine was on the front end. But overall, we faced the same issue of trying to support this team that was much larger than we could handle ourselves. So that came down to, just what I was saying, supporting a growing team is rough. After a certain number of users, if you're working with 5 people, you can manage that on a day-to-day basis. 10 people is kind of stretching it, a lot of your time is spent in meetings. You get to 20 people and all of your time is spent in meetings and you're not doing any development at all, which is not what you want to be doing. So you have to start to balance this time spent supporting your team one-on-one versus developing new features and building out a good code base. We'll talk about that in a minute. Another part that we kind of faced is that teams and the amount of work to be done will always be greater than the number of people available to do it. And that's kind of, no matter how much budget you have, that's always going to be true, because every person you add to the team is going to bring their own ideas, their own wants, their own initiatives to it. And so it's you're always running up against this limit of there's just not enough people to do the amount of work that you want to get done. And then, that leads to most projects out there are understaffed. And you can't, because of that understaffedness, that's not a word, I just made it up, I'm sorry. Because most projects are understaffed, you need to be really respectful of the time of the people that you're supporting. So you can't be wasting their time, making them go through endless process, needless process. And then you also can't be wasting their time by breaking their code, by breaking their projects. They're going to be very busy with their own work. And if you want them to be contributing back to this overall infrastructure, to this global code base, then you need to be very respectful of their time. So, we can easily, as I mentioned, we can easily support those around us physically. But after a certain number of people, 20, 40, 80, then the physical constraints of a co-located team just don't add up. You can't sit next to everybody on an 80-person team. It just doesn't happen. So what you end up working essentially is, even though you're all in the same building, you are a distributed team. You are a remote team working in the same building because of this physical restraint of I can't sit next to everybody. So we talked about it and we started thinking about open source and how does open source handle this? Because jQuery, a very popular open source project, has hundreds of thousands of users and contributors as well from all over the world, and they work for free. So open source faces these problems that we face in our own day-to-day jobs. they have to be really good at scaling. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of users. How do they support that? They can't do one-on-one for every single user out there. And something that you'll often find is that as an open source project becomes more and more popular, it becomes less responsive and harder and harder to maintain, and that single maintainer just can't keep up with everything. So a lot of times a project's success turns out to be its demise because it just can't bear the weight of its user base anymore. They also have to rely on volunteers for a lot of their work and a lot of their contributions. They don't have a big budget. Most of them don't have any budget at all. So how do you get users to volunteer their time? How do you get contributors to willingly give back to the code base without getting paid for it? How do you foster that? They also have to be distributed. Very few open source teams work in the same office building. You end up having contributors from all over the world, and you want that. You want people to be comfortable contributing, whether they're in the US, in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, any country, in Africa, any country out there, country, continent, it's the same thing, right? Oh man. Any country or continent out there, you want them to be able to commit code and commit their ideas and their passion to your project. But the truth is they manage and they do quite well. There are a million open source projects that fail, but many, many, many of them are outstanding successes, and our industry wouldn't be what it is without open source software. So they're able to overcome these problems. How do they overcome it? Well, that's what we're interested in, and what I'm going to talk about today is how do you foster an open source culture at work? So this doesn't mean that you need to make your work or your project open source. That's not what this talk is about. This talk is about realizing that open source does a lot of things well, especially the projects that go really well. So how can we as a culture, as a company culture, foster a more open, maintainable, and friendly project by taking this open source approach at work? Well, there are three big things to this. The first is you want to reduce the friction to contribute. As I mentioned, people are strapped for time. So how can we make it easier for people to give back without having to spend an entire day going through some process? But how do you also make sure that the code quality is up to the standards that you would expect for a large infrastructure code base? How can you also evolve your product without causing this constant headache for people who helped you get where you are? So what that means is, how do you make new features and introduce breaking changes without breaking people's projects right off the bat? That's not a good thing to do, and it's definitely not going to earn you any applause if you break some of these projects. So how do you do that empathetically? How do you do that with kindness towards the product? And then finally, how do we embrace this human community at work? Just because it's work doesn't mean it's not human. We want to build a community that's supportive and encouraging. And how do we avoid the politics that so often come with big companies? So we'll take these three items one at a time. The first one we're going to start off with is, how do we reduce the friction to contribute? Again, everyone is busy. Nobody wants to waste their time. Open source faces this every day. In fact, they face it even tougher because their contributors are usually contributing during the weekend. So they don't have that time to waste. Some of them take time away from their family to contribute code. And so we have to be really respectful of that. Start off with this idea that it's better to have people think you're a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. I was trying to find the original source for this, the original person who said this. And some people say it was Lincoln. Some people say it was Mark Twain. All I know is I originally heard it on Home Improvement. Wilson W. Wilson, the great sage of home improvement, said it, and he may have been quoting either Lincoln or Mark. I call him Mark. He's my buddy. But anyway, that's beside the point. It was really good advice. And the idea, bringing it back to programming, is that you want to assume that developers are uncomfortable and intimidated when they're contributing code. Not all of them are. And some of them are a little too comfortable contributing code, and that could be another issue. But the overall idea is that the number one friction to contributing code to a code base is this fear. You have a fear that you're going to look foolish, or you have a fear that you're going to break something and, again, look foolish, look like you don't know what you're doing. And those who don't have this fear, well, they're just suffering from what's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I would recommend looking that up if you're not familiar with it, because chances are, if you're not familiar with it, you may have it. So, fear. How do we reduce this fear? Well, one way we can do this is by using automation to prevent dumb mistakes. Dumb mistakes like leaving a semicolon off and ending up breaking the code in some weird, random way. It happens. And so if we can follow a consistent standard and automate that check, it makes things a lot easier, because it's nicer to hear that you're wrong from a computer or from a bot than it is to hear it from another human. And as a human, you're more likely to let something slide than a bot, because after a while of saying, oh, you forgot your semicolon, you kind of think, well, it's okay that they forgot their semicolon, or it's okay that they made this a global, because really it's just one time and who cares. A bot doesn't have that ability to wear down its resistance to code smells. A bot will always be strict, and it's always going to just say it in an objective way. It's never going to be mean about it. It's a bot. It doesn't judge you. It just states a fact. Hey, you forgot a semicolon. Hey, you declared a global variable. Hey, those are bad things. You shouldn't do them. So just don't. Here's an example of someone who submitted code to an open source project and got that red X there is a warning that the code style wasn't up, or that there was a style error. And without any human interaction at all, he was able to fix that code style error right away. And he was probably happy for it, because he knows, oh, I messed it up, but that's okay, because nobody had to take their time away from it. I'll just go fix it. So how can we get this into our project? Well, if you're using something like Git for your code source repository, which is recommended because it's got a lot of great features, including this one, there are some tools out there that make it really easy to do this type of check. So one of them is on a pre-commit, you can lint your code. So before anybody can commit their code to save their code to the repo, it goes through and it checks for common errors like missing semicolons or other things like that. You can also do like a style check using a cool tool called JSCS. And that will check for proper spacing and whether you're using the right amount of in horizontal indentation, 2 spaces, 4 spaces, tabs. But you can also do checks on pre-push. So before we push this code up to our common repository, we want to actually build it and make sure it builds. And then we're going to run our unit test and maybe our functional test as well. And what's great about all of this is all of this work is being done without the infrastructure developers being involved. All of this checking and validating that things work is also done on the developer's computer before it even becomes public. So they're able to get that feedback immediately. They don't have to wait for somebody to review the code, and they're able to have it privately. They don't have to risk feeling foolish because they got something wrong. So highly recommended. Look for Git pre, I believe, is an NPM module for that. Another way to prevent fear from rising up in your contributors is to automate testing. Aside from preventing regressions, automated testing is a great way to provide newcomers with a set of requirements to test their code changes against. So a lot of times when you're new on a project, you're going to make a change to this one bit of functionality, but you have no idea about this other functionality over here. So automated testing helps with that. If you have good code coverage for unit tests, then that can help catch things that the contributor would not have thought of because they just haven't spent enough time with the code. And that's fine. I mean, everybody's a newcomer at some point, so let's help them out. It also allows them more confidence. Hey, all my tests are passing. Okay, I didn't break things too terribly. Even if something broke, it's probably not going to be a horrible thing. So they can commit their change. And then it also makes your job easier as an infrastructure developer because you can trust that changes won't break stuff. If you see a pull request and you see all these green check marks saying automated test pass, code style test pass, JS lint passed, well, then you know that things are looking pretty good for the code, and you don't have to manually check out the branch or manually load the code on your machine, test it out. It's probably a good idea to do just in case, but for really small changes, that takes a lot of time over, 20 commits a week. That ends up being a lot of time. So anywhere where you can automate that makes your job a lot easier, which again saves time. But despite all of this time that we can spend trying to prevent mistakes, except that developers mess up, and that automated tests are great, but they're never going to cover every scenario. And you don't really want them to cover every scenario because that's just going to waste so much time writing those tests. So let developers mess up. And by that, the way you do that is you spend time planning for recovery from mistakes. So you make it easy to revert changes. You have a code deployment system that if something goes out to production that's broken, you can easily push a new, easily revert the changes, get the old version out there, and then triage it without the fear of, oh my God, production is broken. Expect failure because we're humans, and plan for it, and plan recovery systems, and mess up because that's how you become more resilient as a code base. Other ways that you can help out is to write documentation. Everybody says that we need more documentation. We need more documentation. But what they don't say is that nobody's going to read the documentation. Okay, some people may say RTFM. Read the fine manual is what they mean. But that's not a nice thing to say to somebody who doesn't have a lot of time. You want to say, hey, I got your question. And that's actually a question that I get pretty often. I've written something about it. What do you think about it? Does that make sense? Did I even write this documentation right? If not, let me know because I want to make it better for other people. So be kind and point them the right way. Don't expect them to read 100 pages of documentation. They don't have the time. Be friendly about it. This also, when you get these docs written, even if nobody reads them, it at least saves you the trouble of having to write the same email again and again, explaining the same concept again and again. And usually when you end up doing that, you end up becoming bitter towards the person who's asking an honest question and ends up feeling like you're a jerk because they've only asked the question once. They don't know that this question has been asked 100 times. It's been asked once by them. And so if you have this documentation you can point to, then you can just copy and paste a common form email. Hey, thank you for the question. Here's the documentation on that. Please read through it. If you still have questions, if the documentation doesn't explain it, come back to me. I'd be happy to help. But try this first and see if that helps. On the note of documentation, examples are worth 1,000 technical words. So when you're writing your documentation, add as many examples out there as you want. A great example of this is the Bootstrap library, the CSS visual UI library out there. I think a majority of their success is owed to the fact that they have code and a live example and all you need in one place to get started. So if you want to try out Bootstrap, you go to their website, you grab their main files, and then you go to the specific component that you want to test out. You copy that HTML code. You don't have to copy the CSS code. It's already there. You paste it into your page and you see it works. And at least that gives the developers a starting point to go with. Compared to another scenario, which is just explaining it all in very technical details, that can get really bogged down and hard to read. So here's an example of that. I had switched over from grep in my command line to ACK, and I'm not even on ACK anymore because, hey, why not try out new stuff? But I was trying it out, and I was trying to search for a class called tag in my code. And when I searched for it, I got some weird results. This is one of the files that returned, and it returned these lines of code. P-class text center, which is not a class of tag. I have no idea why it found that. So I thought about it for a second, like, why in the world did that search not work? I said .tag, and that search should have returned CSS, not HTML. Why was it returning HTML? And HTML that didn't even have the right thing. Well, it was because it was treating .tag as a regex, as a regular expression. And so it was treating that period as like any character followed by tag. And you see here we have the word stag. S is any character and tag is tag. And so like once I realized that, I was like, oh, okay, that makes a lot more sense. Why didn't I see that in the documentation? Because this is what the documentation looks like. Ack, options, pattern, okay, and then file ... Now, you may be familiar with this type of pattern. This is a common pattern that the command line uses and all that kind of stuff. But for me, as somebody who is not as familiar with the command line, all I'm thinking at is, why are you yelling at me? Why are you saying pattern? What is a pattern in file ... What if I want to search folders? How do I do that sort of stuff? Well, I guess options, that sounds good. So let's look at these options. Oh, these are all the options? Like you see, that's a very small text to fit it all on one screen. But these are all the options that I could read through to figure out how to search for a simple class name. So this is what I mean by like heavy technical documentation. And it's very difficult for somebody who just wants to do a simple thing to get through. Instead, we could show off some examples. Okay, here's searching a simple term. Here's searching a quoted term with an escaped value. Here's searching something that's only words using the -w option. So by showing examples, and lots of examples, it's a lot easier for somebody to learn and kind of get through their brain what it looks like to work. Again, as I mentioned with Bootstrap, they have this built into their site. So they have the live example on their page that you can inspect with your developer tools and you can try out. And then they have the HTML there ready to copy and paste. And it just makes getting started so much easier. Good variable naming. Talk about that for a second. Good variable naming and organization is like a TLDR for your code. If I don't have to spend my time trying to figure out what your clever bit of code is doing, then that's time that I save. So if I want to contribute to a code base, but I have to spend 30 minutes trying to figure out what the heck everything does, that's wasted time, and you're going to get less contributors because they're going to run out of time. Contributors will run out of time. It happens. So when you're writing your code, you want to focus on readable code over clever and small code. And if you can use variable names that mean what they actually are, versus trying to condense it down to the smallest little thing, and I'm going to take out all the vowels because those are just wasted letters. Who came up with vowels anyway? That really reduces the readability of your code. And I can't take credit for this, but the idea that you write your code once, but you're going to read it again and again and again and again. And so you want to optimize for reading your code versus writing your code. Code comments help, but this is a post on Twitter that I just loved about this is what code comments are. You've got basmati rice, and inside it you have cookies. I think that the cookies are a upgrade on the rice, but still you have this label that just doesn't have any application to that, to the actual thing. So the idea here is keep your code comments up front and center and make them obvious when they're wrong. It's easy to hide your documentation in a wiki because you think wikis are great. I can easily edit them and I can change them, write them on the fly. But the best place to have your code documentation is in the code itself, because that's where people are going to look when they want to try to figure something out. They're not going to think, oh, I should go look at this wiki that I don't even remember the URL to, and then I need to search through the wiki, but the wiki search functionality kind of sucks, so I can't really find things. Oh man, this is too much work. I don't have the time. Let's just go on to something else. So again, keep your code where people look for it, or keep your documentation where people look for it. And then apply dry rules to your documentations as well. Don't repeat stuff. If you have a variable name in your function, in your arguments that you pass into a function, do you really need to repeat that variable name in your code comments? I think that's kind of silly, because you're basically repeating yourself, and somebody's going to come along, guarantee they're going to change the variable name and forget to change it in the code comments, and then you have this situation right here. Finally, with all of this, while you want to encourage people to contribute, you want to help them contribute, you want to remove the hurdles for their contribution. Know that many people want to help, but won't be able to. They're going to run out of time. They're going to go down these little rabbit holes and figure out that, they need to get back to the project that they're working on, that they're actually getting paid to do. And they have a lot of tight project deadlines that they have to meet. So encourage it, be open about it, but don't fret too much about it. If people aren't contributing to your code base and you've done all these things to make it easy, let it go. They just don't have the time, and forcing them to do it isn't going to fix anything. A quick story on this: don't try gimmicks to get contributions. Don't try and do contests. Hey, the person who commits the most code to the repo gets a prize. They get something cool, because they simply don't work. And to give you a good example of this, at one of my previous jobs, we had this pumpkin carving contest for Halloween. I thought it was really cool. Hey, we're all going to have a contest. Everybody, come up with some really creative ideas and show off their stuff. We had about 200 people who were eligible to enter the contest. And we had these really awesome prizes. We had like a Kindle and an Amazon Fire, and I think even an iPad or something like that, maybe an iPad mini. And 200 entries. I thought I was going to come into the office Sunday morning right after Halloween, or maybe it was Friday morning right before Halloween, which would make a lot more sense for a pumpkin carving contest, and just see like 100 pumpkins, and we wouldn't even know where to store them, and then how are we going to get rid of them? We had 4 entries out of about 200 people, despite all these amazing prizes. I didn't enter it myself because it came around to like Thursday night, and it was kind of late, and I had maybe 20 minutes, and I thought, there's going to be so many other entries. Why even try? It's not worth it, because there's no way I'm going to win the prize, because somebody's going to have spent an hour and a half carving this awesome pumpkin. And so I didn't enter, and many, many, many other people didn't enter, because contests, they undermine your efforts to encourage somebody. If you're using a contest to motivate people, you're undermining their core motivation of, I want to contribute something purposeful. I want to add something meaningful to this project. And I know it's not great, or I know it's not amazing, or 200 hours worth of work. It's 30 minutes worth of work, but it's better than 0 minutes worth of work. So again, don't resort to these gimmicks if people can't contribute. If they can't contribute, accept it and move on.